So now I want to talk to you about facial anatomy. We've talked about muscular anatomy, later we'll talk a little bit about skeletal anatomy, but now we want to focus on just the face itself. Kind of like when we were doing hands and I mentioned that fingers and toes represent more than half the bones in our body, and when we're modeling the body, the hands often take as long as the rest of the body. Well, the face is a whole other thing. I find that doing the face often takes me sometimes even twice as long as to do as the rest of the body because we're so geared towards seeing faces. Faces are really complex. This is just a screen grab of the anatomy reference board that I put up for you that you can find on our Discord under course materials. And it's not even comprehensive. There's so much more to know here because humans are really good at perceiving faces. In fact, that's how we tell people's moods and emotions. That's how we have empathy. And so if you see a chair in the corner and that chair's legs are just 5 millimeters too short, you're not going to notice. It's still a chair. If you saw someone's face and their ears were 5 millimeters out of alignment, you couldn't help but notice. And while faces we see them as completely different because we identify from each other, really when it comes down to the measurement of it, faces aren't that different and they're very, very similar. So our brains are very attuned to noticing the differences, which means our brains are really, really good at noticing when something is wrong with a face. However, the hard part as being an artist is you'll see the face, you'll know something's wrong with it, other people who know something's wrong with it, but you won't always know what's wrong with it. So let's try to break it down a little bit. The first thing is that faces are built on skulls. This is what's interesting to me about faces is they're so radically different, but if you look at skulls, you couldn't tell which skull went with what face, and skulls look more or less the same. Skulls themselves are made up of a couple of big shapes. I'm going to use my little pen tool here to draw out some notes. So we can think about the skull as, I like to think about it as a sphere that has the sides kind of lopped off. So like if you drew out like a big sphere here and you made a cross-sectional cut, big sphere, slice off the sides, that's kind of the shape you get on the side. And then after that, a lot of these shapes are more or less like sort of cylinders or like half cylinders. Like it was once described to me by an art teacher of mine that the mouth, this whole area, is almost like a big orange. That's like, it's the size of an orange in your mouth. And another thing to note is that even though our eyes are very small, the eye opening is actually very large because the eye itself is inside this little cavity and it has muscles and tissue that stretch out all over this. And that's what gives us our cheekbones right here, is this ridge. It's called the zygomatic arch, and it's a really crucial landmark. So this is what makes someone's cheekbone kind of pop out. A couple things that I'm going to talk about too when I get into proportions, but I just want you to see the underlying structure. The mouth isn't flat and it's not recessed. It pops out. Our teeth tend to make a more curved out form. And again, brows can be different. Sometimes they're protruding more. Sometimes they'll recede more. Sometimes they'll be more flat. It depends on the person. And also the squareness. There's like this sort of flat space on the front. Tends to get very flat right there. And so when we're thinking about these shapes, we're often thinking in terms of, I'll talk about like concave, convex, or planar. So concave meaning that it's a surface that comes in, convex meaning it's a surface that pops out, and planar meaning it's completely flat. So like this surface, I can see, if I'm looking at the skull, we can see it kind of curves in. So that's kind of concave. And I can see other areas, convex, that sort of bump out. And then some areas, like right here, are very flat or planar. When we get to proportions, there's a couple key locations. Last time we talked about body proportions, I talked about Loomis. This is another diagram from Loomis. And the convention, this is a pretty common convention for breaking down the shapes of heads. You might see diagrams like this yourself before. Here's the real crucial thing. If you take the whole head and think about it as a square, and you know the hair is always sitting on top, but imagine the head as a large square, so front to back. And so this would be completely square in its shape. Right about halfway through that square, just about halfway through is our eye line. So this is that halfway point, and it's right along the middle of our eyes. Whenever you see people, especially like children, draw faces, they tend to draw faces like, you know, like this, and then they'll put the hair on top. Because we're so focused on the face, as children, they tend to exaggerate it. In fact, they say it's actually kind of a test to see if young children are sociopaths, is do they draw faces like this, or do they draw faces more like this? Because if they draw faces more like this, which is more realistic, that means they're seeing them as actual shapes and they're not developmentally focusing on the expressions of faces. So it's actually fascinating a little bit there, but we're paying attention to that. Now we have the eye line, and about halfway from the eye line to the chin now is the bottom of the nose. Again, varies from person to person. These are just general conventions, landmarks, if you will, that we can always deviate from. And then about halfway down from this to this, so this is about this line, is conventionally right about the bottom of the lip. Another halfway down is about the top of the chin. So again, we get like halfway down my head is my eyes, halfway from here down here is the bottom of my nose, halfway from here to here is about the bottom of my lip, and then halfway from here to here is about the top of my chin. So that can really help you kind of just by measuring by halves. Now, another thing that's really important is thinking again about this as a box. Halfway through the box here is where the ear starts. And so right at this eye line, about halfway, is where the connection for the ear actually begins. And then that halfway mark down is about where the bottom of the earlobe lines up. And the brow line, coming just a hair above our eye line, is also about where the ear stops. Again, exaggerated characters might be different, but we want to understand the general rules first. So this is a good model to break things down, to like start thinking about things. And again, as we mentioned before with some of the head proportions, think about the skull doesn't just come out and down. It comes all the way back, even though we don't pay as much attention to it. This is one of the hard things about doing, especially faces. I mean, characters in general are hard to do. Faces are the hardest part to do, but I want to show you how to kind of try to tackle them anyway, because the only way to get good faces is to do lots of them. Forewarning. Your face in this class, in this project, might not come out great. That's okay. It's the first one. We're just trying to get the workflow down and practice. The best way I got good at faces was just making 4 or 5 of them a day. So I could just practice and churn out and repeat the process. And it got you really fast, and you learned how to solve your mistakes later. So there's a couple other key landmarks that we want to look at here. The eyes are generally one eye length apart from each other. So it's about the same spacing. And if you take another eye out, it kind of lines up with the side of the head. So the side of the head is almost like 5 eyes wide. Then at the same time, the midline between these eyes is right almost there, not quite the corners of the mouth. And the gap between the eyes is right about where the nostrils go. So these are things that, again, it's hard to see. These are oversimplifications, but these are some landmarks that you can generally visually measure. So you might look at your character design and say, hey, how does the center of the eye line up with the corner of the mouth, and how should it? When we're talking about overall proportions, we can also think about things in thirds, because the head also breaks down well into some overall thirds. This is another a slightly different model that focuses more on the face, but it thinks about the face as the bottom 2/3, and basically this top of the head and the brow up as the top third, with the nose being the section in between. So this represents the top. Let me change a different color so it's more visible. Like here we have the brow line, and then down here down to the nose. And so everything down here is sort of focused on the mouth. Everything here is focused on the eyes and the nose. And then you can see we end with the brows, and up at the top is where we have our head. This little line, this little section also is where our hair tends to start. So our hairline tends to be from back here and sort of come back at an angle like so. So just another way of looking at it, and this is also what we call a planar view of the head, which I'll talk about in a second. When we're thinking about looking at the head, we want lots of angles and lots of reference from lots of different sides, because unlike when we're drawing a face, so if I'm just sketching out a face, all I have to worry about is one angle, one side, one set of proportions, one set of features. And that's easy enough to do, but what does it look like rotated? That's the challenge of 3D modeling. It's got to be in 3D. So start looking at some of these planes and how they go together. This is a planar example of a head. This is sort of a classical model, and you can see the flatness that they sort of produce in a couple areas. So like this is a really crucial shape, is this sort of trapezoid up here that leads into the nose. We'll talk more about individual features, but you can see, when we're taking this planar analysis of things, it can often make really revealing to us about what the underlying shapes are. So let's start going feature by feature. With the eyes, there's a couple of rules that you want to keep in mind. I have a bunch of models here, but one of the most important things about the eyes is the eyes are not flat on your head, where they're actually angled quite a bit back. I know I use my pen a lot to say like it's angled like this. So the eye isn't forward, it angles back. The whole cavity tends to push backwards. So if I'm looking at it, the head from a top view, and here is my head, and I got like my ear line. My eyes are on this plane like this. Because the head is round, they sort of slant out to the sides. It wouldn't be right for the eyes to be lined up straight. Some animals, like a lot of apes, actually do have their faces are very flat and their eyes are very straightly aligned. Ours are very round and they tend to move outward compared to some of the primates. Another important thing to note is that there's an overhang. The top of the eye tends to overhang the lower part of the eye, and the eye structure itself goes down, like there's this lower lid, and then it goes into the cheek. So it comes down into this lower lid, and then the cheek comes out right from it. It's a really important form to understand. Is anytime we see a line, like if you would draw a line in illustration, it means there's a convergence of 2 points. Usually a line means, as I mentioned, concavity, and the reflection represents some kind of convexity in its shape. So like looking at this model here, we can see a simplified breakdown. Another way I like to think I like to think about the eye is there's a couple of key points here, here, and here, and I sort of connect an imaginary line between them to break up the eye. And the reason I like this is because those points are here, 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 and right about here. So if we say this is 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is 1, 2, 3, and 4, because remember from that top-down view, if we're looking at it, the eyes are slanted back. There's the ear, maybe some hair, and a little nose. We know the eyes are slanted back, therefore this is further in than the other one. And I find it's right about there, so getting this diamond shape sometimes, thinking about it in key points, can really help you get things lined up a little bit better. Again, just a couple key blockouts, ways of understanding the shapes that are happening here. The eye is itself an eyeball that we see sort of proportionally is more like this. Even though we only see part of the eye, the eyeball itself is a lot larger. And what we have over top of it is some sort of lid on the top and the bottom that helps us open and close it. And so that's how you get the eye shape. And the eye itself is usually sitting on top. So by what I mean on top is like if we have our eyelid, usually our iris, the inner part of our eyelid, it's sitting right where the lid is on top, and the outer part of the eye with all the color in it is usually a little bit more out like that. Again, every one of these subjects I could do an entire week on, just eye anatomy, but there's a lot to go through here. I just want you to start with it. The nose is, it's interesting the way people think about noses. To some degree, they're one big shape, and to some degree, they're 4 smaller shapes. So the nose can be, I like to think about the nose as sort of 3 spheres and 1 box or cube-shaped rectangle. So I've got 1 sphere, 2 spheres, and my nether nostril is the 3rd sphere. And then my nose, the bridge itself, is sort of this shape. It's sort of a box that slopes out. And it's not... again, a mistake people make is the nose is not that kind of shape. It's not this. The nose is actually much more like that, the sort of bridge itself. And the bridge tends to narrow right about at the eye line, so it comes in and then it sort of sweeps out. It's a very exaggerated Roman nose. Now, of course, this lower region of the nose is also broken into many smaller cartilage pieces, which is why you sometimes get some of these other smaller, more refined features. That's some real detail, and again, collecting a lot of reference is the key to doing this very well. But understanding the nose, to me, is about understanding that it's really a combination of 3 spheres and 1 cube, and we'll actually be building it that way. Then we talk about the mouth. Similar to the eyes, they have an overhang, and that overhang is really important. So we have the lips, and they have these kind of shapes, but we see the top of the lip overhangs by quite a bit. And the lips are also broken into their own shapes. Sometimes people describe it, again, as 2 circles here, 1 circle on top, and then this sort of swoopy bat wing thing up here. But what I find is interesting about this area is there is this sort of kind of divot right under your lip that lets you do that. And then this side part where these fat tissues are tends to be a much softer transition. I like these kind of diagrams because they really help you understand what's happening here. Now, you're not going to sketch out all of this, but it's going to help you get some subtlety. And again, we want to get that sense of the mouth being right there. Now, if we were modeling these characters for like articulation to like talk, we would actually be sculpting out the insides of the mouths and creating something called a mouth bag. That's a little advanced for what we want to do here. So we'll mostly be keeping the mouths closed for these characters for this one. So we won't have to worry too much about the intricacies of that. Then we get to the ear. The ear is pretty intimidating because it seems like a really complicated shape, and it's hard because unlike noses or mouths, we don't spend a lot of time looking at them. Eyes and like lips are something people draw in like, you know, middle school notebooks all the time. But when's the last time you saw someone drawing a bunch of ears? You probably think they were nuts. Ears have their own position and they have their own angles that are really important. So the ear is definitely an alignment with some of these features, but it also has a couple of angles that are really key. So when I say it starts back here, it does kind of, but it usually angles back just a little bit. So we see in this diagram, there's an angle to where the ear actually starts. And we also see that there's an angle branching out of the ears. So again, my ear tends to slant out this way. And from a top view, it also has an angle coming off, maybe about 22.5 degrees or something like that. These are really crucial angles. Now the shapes themselves, there's a couple ways to describe it, but usually I hear the common model, the one that a lot of people like to use, is this idea of a hook, like a fish hook, and the letter Y. So you have this shape here, which is like a large fish hook kind of shape. And then inside of that, we have the letter Y sort of curving out. And this is, I mean, ears are all shapes and sizes. Animals have very different ears, but we can see these are the shapes that generally come together, this hook, and then this sort of Y shaped here. And then there's those shapes of sort of the lower lobe. And then we have, I don't recall the name of it, but it's this little extra little piece of skin here that helps keep stuff out of our ears as we're moving forward. And that's moves in under here is sort of where the ear canal opens into. Again, we can also simplify it, and a lot of folks will, and just take a basic shape and give you something like that, with this being more of a cavity, and you mostly get the idea. But if you want to get something a little closer to human proportions, we're going to do something a little bit more like that. So, kind of the wrap up of the head, and I just want to bring this back, before I cut the video out, and just a brief reminder that it's all based on the core shapes. And so we want to make sure that we have that egg and this cylinder and then this cylinder first, because then we can start building those features on top of them, getting the proportions right and figuring out where all of the other bits for our character need to come from. Otherwise, we're going to really struggle. The diagrams and like examples like this can be really helpful to help you not make some mistakes. Thinking about where things like the widest point on the head is going to be, right on the side of the skull. So right there and right about there. That's a really important thing to know, is where should it be at its widest? And just be checking it constantly. You're not going to get it all right at once, but the more you check it, the more it's going to be instinctive to you. All right, I'll see you in the next one.